In the autumn of 1863, beneath the canopy of oak trees draped in Spanish moss on the Thornhill Plantation in Mobile County, Alabama, 9 white men died within hours of each other during what should have been the most celebrated wedding the region had witnessed in a decade. Their deaths were not random. They were not accidents of tainted food or spoiled wine. They were the calculated act of a woman named Clara, an enslaved cook who had served the Thornhill family for 23 years, who had nursed their children, who had prepared their meals with hands that never trembled until that particular October evening when she decided that silence was no longer bearable. You are watching Shadows of the South, where we unearth the most disturbing and forgotten stories of the slave-holding South, the tales that reveal not just what happened, but what such a system did to the human soul. The Thornhill Plantation sprawled across 2,000 acres of prime cotton land, worked by nearly 240 enslaved men, women, and children. Colonel Marcus Thornhill, 58 years old, had inherited the property from his father and expanded it through calculated marriages and strategic land purchases throughout the 1840s and 50s. He was a man of considerable education, having studied law briefly in Charleston before returning to manage the family enterprise. His temperament was cold rather than cruel in the theatrical sense. He did not whip his slaves in fits of rage. He administered punishment with the detached efficiency of a man balancing ledgers. His wife, Constance, 44, was the daughter of a Virginia tobacco baron, a woman who prided herself on her Christian charity even as she oversaw a household built entirely on stolen labor. She taught Sunday school to the plantation children, white and black alike, though the lessons differed considerably depending on the color of the student. The Thornhills had 3 living children: Thomas, the heir, 26 years old, and recently returned from a failed attempt at military service due to a lung condition; Margaret, 22, engaged to a cotton broker from Montgomery; and young Samuel, 14, still under the tutelage of a private instructor. Among the enslaved community, there existed a quiet hierarchy born not of choice but of proximity to power. Clara was at the center of this world. She was 41 years old in 1863, though she looked older, her hands marked by decades of heat and labor, her eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of a woman who had borne witness to too much. She had been purchased at age 18, brought to Thornhill from a failed plantation in Georgia after its owner drank himself into bankruptcy. She had given birth to 4 children, all of whom had been sold away before their 10th birthdays, a practice Colonel Thornhill justified as economically sound and morally neutral. Working alongside Clara in the main house were Moses, 53, the head butler, a man of extraordinary dignity who had taught himself to read using discarded newspapers and whose memory held more of the plantation's true history than any written record; Rachel, 28, a house servant who had been repeatedly violated by Thomas Thornhill and had borne him 2 children who were never acknowledged; James, 19, a field hand recently moved to house service, strong and quietly furious; Dinah, 36, the laundress, who sang hymns while she worked and whose voice could break your heart; Samuel, not to be confused with the youngest Thornhill boy, 41, a carpenter and blacksmith whose hands could fix anything but could not protect his daughter from being sold to settle a gambling debt; Esther, 24, Rachel's sister, who worked in the dairy and whose mind had learned to drift somewhere far away during the worst moments; and Tobias, 67, the oldest among them, who had survived 3 different owners and who told stories of Africa that may or may not have been memories. The wedding was to be a grand affair. Thomas Thornhill was marrying Catherine Beaumont, the 19-year-old daughter of Judge Edmund Beaumont of Selma, a union that would consolidate significant political and economic power across central Alabama. The ceremony was planned for Saturday, October 10th, with festivities to continue through the weekend. Guests would include not just family, but the leading planters of the region, men whose collective holdings represented tens of thousands of acres and thousands of human beings held in bondage. Colonel Thornhill saw the wedding as an opportunity to demonstrate his family's prominence, to showcase the elegance and sophistication that cotton money could buy. The preparations consumed months. The main house was repainted, new furniture was commissioned, and Clara, as head cook, was given instructions to prepare a feast that would be remembered for generations. It was in late August, during these preparations, that the triggering incident occurred. Rachel's younger child, a boy of 3 named Benjamin, fell ill with fever. The illness progressed rapidly, and Rachel begged Constance Thornhill for permission to send for a doctor. Constance refused, stating that it was likely nothing serious, and that calling a physician for a slave child was an unnecessary expense. The boy died 4 days later. Thomas Thornhill was in the room when it happened, showed no emotion, and left without a word. That evening, Clara found Rachel in the kitchen quarters, silent and hollow-eyed, holding the small body wrapped in an old flour sack. It was Moses who suggested they bury the child in the small plot beyond the tobacco barn, where other slave children lay in unmarked graves. They did so by lamplight, without ceremony, because even grief was a luxury that could be regulated. Clara stood at that graveside, and something fundamental shifted in her understanding of the world. She had survived 23 years by accepting what could not be changed. But watching Rachel's face, watching Moses's hands shake as he covered the tiny grave with Alabama red clay, Clara understood that acceptance was its own form of death. Pause for a moment and reflect. In a world where a mother could be denied even the small mercy of trying to save her child, where a boy could die unmourned except by those who had no power to mourn openly, what happens to the concept of justice? What becomes of morality when it is applied selectively, when humanity itself becomes a privilege granted by skin color? The planning began quietly. Clara did not announce her intentions or recruit co-conspirators in any formal sense, but she began asking certain questions. She asked Moses, who managed the wine cellar, which bottles would be opened for the wedding toast. She asked Dinah, who had access to the root cellar and the storage areas, about the herbs and plants kept for various household purposes. She asked Samuel the carpenter about the layout of the dining room, about where each guest would sit. She presented these inquiries as part of her responsibility to ensure the dinner went smoothly, and no one questioned her. Among the enslaved community, however, something unspoken circulated. Rachel noticed the change in Clara's demeanor. James noticed the way Clara would pause sometimes while working, staring at nothing, her jaw set in a way that suggested calculation rather than despair. Esther noticed that Clara had stopped singing while she cooked, a habit she had maintained for years. None of them asked directly, because some questions, once voiced, could not be taken back. Clara's method was both simple and devastatingly effective. She had access to several plants that grew wild on the plantation property and in the surrounding woods. Oleander, with its beautiful toxic flowers, pokeweed berries, and most crucially, the roots of white snakeroot, which produced a slow-acting poison that could be masked in rich foods and strong wine. Over the course of September, Clara collected these materials in small quantities, dried them, ground them carefully, and stored the powder in a small tin that had once held baking powder. She tested nothing because testing would have meant potentially revealing her intentions or causing suspicion. If anyone fell ill unexpectedly, she would have one chance, and the wedding feast would be that chance. The selection of victims was not random. Clara had listened to 23 years of conversations, had served countless dinners, had stood invisible in rooms where men discussed politics and profit, where they traded stories of slave sales and discipline techniques, where they joked about the children they fathered with enslaved women and refused to acknowledge. She knew which men had championed the most brutal overseers, which had voted against even the minimal protections some states had considered for enslaved people, which had made fortunes from the domestic slave trade, buying children in Virginia and selling them in Louisiana. She knew which planters had responded to rumors of rebellion by instituting collective punishments, burning slave quarters, separating families as warnings. And she decided that these men, when they gathered to celebrate Thomas Thornhill's wedding, would instead meet a different kind of reckoning. The wedding day arrived under pale October skies. The ceremony took place in the late afternoon on the plantation grounds, beneath a wooden arbor decorated with late-season roses and cotton bowls, a grotesque symbol of the source of all this wealth. Catherine Beaumont wore imported French lace. Thomas Thornhill wore a gray suit that matched his eyes. Judge Beaumont performed the ceremony himself, invoking God's blessing on the Union. The enslaved workers lined the path as the couple walked back toward the house, a required show of celebration, their faces carefully neutral. Rachel stood among them, still wearing mourning in her heart if not on her person. Clara watched from the kitchen window, her hands already moving through the final preparations for the evening meal. The dinner was to be served at 8 o'clock. 37 guests would be seated in the expanded dining room, with Colonel Thornhill at the head of the table and the new couple seated together to his right. The menu Clara had prepared was extravagant: roasted duck, venison, ham glazed with molasses, oysters brought from Mobile Bay, sweet potatoes candied with sugar, greens cooked with pork fat, cornbread and biscuits, and for dessert, a towering cake decorated with spun sugar. The accompanying wines had been selected by Moses from the Colonel's most prized bottles, reds from France that had cost more than some families earned in a year. Clara had chosen to introduce the poison in two specific dishes: the rich brown gravy that would accompany the venison, and the sweet glaze on the ham. Both were intensely flavored, both would be consumed in quantity, and both would be served primarily to the men, as the women tended to eat more delicately and to avoid the heavier sauces. She had calculated the dosage carefully, knowing that white snakeroot poisoning produced symptoms that might be mistaken initially for acute dyspepsia or heart troubles, and that by the time the true nature of the illness became apparent, it would be too late. She prepared the poisoned gravy in a separate pot, her hands steady, her heart hammering against her ribs. Moses entered the kitchen at one point and stopped, watching her. Their eyes met. He said nothing, did nothing, and then quietly left to attend to his duties in the dining room. That moment of silent witness was perhaps the closest thing to a conspiracy that existed. If you find yourself gripped by these forgotten histories, these stories of resistance and reckoning that the South chose to bury, consider subscribing to Shadows of the South, because we are committed to ensuring that these voices, however dark their stories, are not lost to time. The dinner proceeded with all the ceremony and self-congratulation that such occasions demanded. Toasts were made celebrating the newlyweds, celebrating the Confederacy, despite its increasingly desperate military situation, celebrating the Southern way of life, that was, though none of them could fully acknowledge it yet, already beginning its death throes. The food was praised extravagantly. Colonel Thornhill himself complimented Clara in absentia, telling his guests that she was one of the finest cooks in Alabama, trained up proper from a girl. The gravy was passed and repassed. The ham was carved and served with generous portions of that poisoned glaze. The men ate with the hearty appetite of those who believed themselves masters of the world. The women, as Clara had anticipated, ate more sparingly, and several declined the richer dishes altogether in favor of lighter fare. Clara served alongside Moses and Rachel and James, moving through the room with trays and platters, refilling glasses, clearing plates. She watched each man she had targeted consume the food she had prepared. Colonel Nathaniel Harper, who owned 3 plantations and nearly 600 slaves, and who had personally overseen the whipping death of a man who had tried to escape. Judge Edmund Beaumont himself, father of the bride, who had ruled from the bench that enslaved people could not testify against whites under any circumstances, even in cases of murder. William Crenshaw, who operated a slave trading firm and who had made a fortune separating mothers from children at the auction block in Montgomery. Dr. Samuel Pritchard, who had published papers arguing that black people were biologically inferior and incapable of feeling pain the way white people did. The Reverend Charles Hutchinson, who preached that slavery was ordained by God and that enslaved people should rejoice in their submission, and 4 others, each with their own ledger of cruelties, each believing themselves untouchable, each consuming Clara's vengeance one bite at a time. The first man fell ill around 10 o'clock. It was Colonel Harper, who complained of sudden intense abdominal pain and nausea. Within minutes, Judge Beaumont experienced similar symptoms. Then Dr. Pritchard, the bitter irony not lost on Clara, who watched from the kitchen doorway as the physician clutched his chest and called for someone to loosen his collar. The dinner descended into chaos rapidly. Women screamed. Men rushed to help those who had collapsed. Thomas Thornhill shouted for someone to fetch medical help from Mobile, but Mobile was 14 miles away, and it was night, and the symptoms were progressing with terrible speed. Reverend Hutchinson tried to pray but vomited before he could finish the first verse. William Crenshaw, the slave trader, died on the dining room floor, his body convulsing, his face gray. One by one, the 9 men Clara had selected succumbed. Some died within the hour. Others lingered into the early morning, their bodies racked with pain, their organs failing. The women and the other male guests who had not consumed the poisoned dishes stood helpless, horrified, unable to understand what was happening. Clara remained in the kitchen through all of it. When Constance Thornhill came rushing in, demanding to know what had been in the food, demanding to know if anything had spoiled, Clara looked at her directly and said, "I prepared everything exactly as I have always done, ma'am." Moses stood nearby, his face carefully blank. Rachel kept her eyes down. The rest of the enslaved household staff maintained their positions, performing their duties mechanically, while the house of their oppressors collapsed into nightmare around them. By dawn, 9 men were dead. The wedding celebration had transformed into a wake. Catherine Beaumont, married only hours earlier, was now a widow by proxy as her father lay dead in a plantation bedroom. Colonel Thornhill, having survived by virtue of having eaten less of the tainted food than his guests, was nevertheless violently ill. The surviving guests, traumatized and terrified, began leaving as soon as daylight allowed, desperate to escape what they believed must be some curse or plague. No one in that moment suspected poisoning, or more precisely, no one suspected murder. Because the idea that an enslaved woman might commit such an act was literally unthinkable within the framework of their world. Consider for a moment the peculiar blindness of power. These were men who lived in constant fear of slave rebellion, who enacted brutal laws and punishments to prevent even the possibility of resistance, and yet they had so thoroughly convinced themselves of their own superiority, of the contentment of those they enslaved, that when vengeance came it was incomprehensible to them. The truth emerged slowly, and through unlikely means. It was Tobias, the eldest among the enslaved workers, who finally spoke. 3 days after the deaths, when a team of investigators arrived from Mobile to examine the deaths, Tobias approached them privately and said that Clara had been acting strangely in the weeks before the wedding, that she had been collecting plants from the woods, that he believed in his heart she had done something terrible. Why did Tobias betray her? Perhaps because at 67, he had survived by never taking sides in conflicts that might destroy him. Perhaps because he genuinely believed that mass murder, even of oppressors, was wrong. Perhaps because he was simply tired and afraid of what collective punishment might befall them all if the truth remained hidden. Motives, especially under such circumstances, are never pure or simple. Clara was arrested that afternoon. She did not resist. She did not deny. When questioned, she confirmed that she had poisoned the food, that she had selected her victims deliberately, that she had done so because she had watched for 23 years as these men and others like them destroyed lives with impunity, because she had stood at the grave of a 3-year-old boy who died because his life was not deemed worth the cost of a doctor's visit, because she had nursed Thomas Thornhill as an infant, and then watched him rape and discard the daughter she had come to love as her own. She spoke these truths calmly, without theatrics, as one might recite facts of geography or history. The investigators, all white men, were reportedly disturbed not by her confession, but by the rationality of it, by the clear-minded deliberation it revealed. They had expected madness or demonic possession, something that would fit within their understanding of how the enslaved were supposed to behave. Instead, they found a woman who had made a calculated decision and who did not regret it. The legal proceedings were swift and predetermined. Alabama law provided no real trial for enslaved people accused of murdering whites. Clara was convicted within a day and sentenced to death by hanging. The execution was scheduled for November 3rd, less than a month after the poisoning. In those final weeks, Clara was kept in a small cell in Mobile. She was visited by several ministers who hoped to extract a confession of sin and repentance. She told them she had nothing to confess that they would understand. She was visited once by Constance Thornhill, who came perhaps seeking explanation, or perhaps seeking to deliver condemnation. The conversation between them was never recorded, but Constance left the jail cell in tears, while Clara remained dry-eyed. On the morning of November 3rd, 1863, Clara was hanged in the public square in Mobile, before a crowd of several hundred people. Enslaved people were brought from surrounding plantations and forced to watch the event, intended as a brutal lesson about the consequences of resistance. Rachel was there, her face stone. Moses was there, his shoulders bent as though bearing physical weight. Esther was there, praying quietly. James was there, and the look in his eyes suggested that Clara's execution was teaching a very different lesson than the one the authorities intended. The historical record indicates that Clara spoke no final words, that she walked to the gallows without assistance, and that she did not look away from those who had come to watch her die. In the immediate aftermath, the Thornhill plantation descended into chaos from which it never fully recovered. Colonel Thornhill, broken by illness and the loss of his social standing, died less than a year later. Thomas Thornhill, traumatized by the events of his wedding night and newly widowed, sold much of the plantation land and moved to Charleston, where he lived in increasing isolation until his death from consumption in 1869. Constance Thornhill withdrew from society entirely, living out her remaining years as a recluse, reportedly haunted by questions she could not answer about the woman who had nursed her children and then poisoned her guests. Margaret Thornhill never married, remaining with her mother and developing what contemporary accounts described as nervous disorders. Young Samuel Thornhill was sent to relatives in Virginia and disappeared from the historical record. The 9 men who died that night left behind widows and children whose lives were irrevocably altered. Several of the families suffered financial ruin as their estates and business interests collapsed without the patriarchs to manage them. Judge Beaumont's widow became a vocal advocate for the abolition of slavery, a transformation so radical that she was ostracized by her former social circle, though whether her change of heart came from genuine moral awakening or from trauma and grief remains unclear from the available records. The children of these men grew up in the shadow of that October night, some leaving the South entirely, some carrying forward the same hatreds their fathers had embodied, all marked by an event they could not fully process or understand. Among the enslaved community of the Thornhill plantation, Clara's action had complex and painful consequences. In the months following her execution, several enslaved people were sold as the estate began to dissolve. Families once again scattered across the South. The remaining workers faced increased surveillance and suspicion from overseers and neighboring planters who feared copycat actions. Rachel and her surviving child were sold to a plantation in Georgia. Moses was eventually freed during the final months of the Civil War, but died of pneumonia before he could leave Alabama. Esther and Dinah both survived to see emancipation and worked as washerwomen in Mobile for the remainder of their lives. James escaped to Union lines in 1864 and served in the United States Colored Troops. Tobias died on the plantation in early 1865, just weeks before freedom came, having lived long enough to see the system that had held him for 6 decades begin to crumble, but not long enough to experience life beyond it. The question of how to remember Clara and what she did remains complicated and morally fraught even at this distance. She was not a revolutionary in the conventional sense. She did not lead a rebellion or attempt to overthrow the system. She committed an act of targeted murder that brought death to 9 men and destruction to countless others, including members of her own community. Yet she acted within a context of such profound and systematic evil that the moral calculus becomes nearly impossible to navigate. The 9 men she killed were not innocent. They were active and enthusiastic participants in a system of human bondage that destroyed millions of lives across generations. They had each personally contributed to untold suffering. Does that justify what Clara did? Does context excuse murder? Or is there something in her action that transcends simple categories of right and wrong, something that speaks to the unbearable weight of watching evil perpetuate itself with no hope of justice through any legitimate means? Consider what it means to be denied every form of legal recourse, every path to justice, every recognition of your humanity. Consider what it means to watch your children sold, to see a boy die because his life is not valued enough for medical care, to serve meals to men who joke about the bodies they have violated and the families they have destroyed. Consider what it means to know that every legal system, every religious institution, every social structure exists to reinforce your powerlessness. In that context, what becomes of morality? What remains of civilization when it has already been stripped away by those in power? The historical record gives us facts but struggles to give us truth. We know that Clara killed 9 men. We know she was executed for it. We know the plantation collapsed and the families scattered, and the South continued its brutal machinery of slavery for another 1.5 years, until Sherman's march and Union victory finally brought the system crashing down. But what we cannot know from the documents and the records is what Clara felt in those final moments before the poisoned gravy was served, whether she experienced doubt or peace or fury, or simply the cold determination of someone who had decided that silence was no longer survivable. We cannot know if she believed her action would change anything beyond that one terrible night, if she hoped it might inspire others, or if she simply needed to strike back once before she died. We cannot know if she thought about Rachel's dead son, or her own sold children, or all the countless others who had suffered and would suffer, or if in the end it was simply about making the powerful taste, however briefly, the fear and helplessness they had inflicted on others. The Thornhill plantation land was eventually subdivided and sold. The main house, where the poisoned wedding feast took place, stood until 1878, when it was destroyed by fire under circumstances that were never fully explained. The small plot beyond the tobacco barn, where Rachel's son and other slave children were buried, was plowed over and planted with cotton. No markers remain. The Mobile County Courthouse records contain the trial transcript and execution order for Clara, whose last name we do not definitively know because she, like so many enslaved people, was recorded only by her first name and her owner's property designation. We know she existed, we know what she did, we know she died for it. Beyond that, the historical record goes silent, as it so often does for those who had the misfortune to live and die in bondage. These stories from the antebellum South, these accounts of violence and resistance and moral catastrophe, are difficult to confront because they resist easy categorization. They force us to reckon with the complexity of human behavior under extreme oppression, with the question of what we might do if placed in similar circumstances, with the recognition that the clean lines we draw between right and wrong become distorted and strange when the entire social structure is built on a foundation of systematic evil.
Clara's story does not provide comfort or easy answers. It provides instead a glimpse into the terrible logic of a system that treated human beings as property, that gave some people absolute power over others, and that then acted shocked and horrified when that power was met with desperate violence. The legacy of that October night in 1863 extends far beyond the 9 men who died and the 1 woman who was executed for killing them. It extends into the families that were scattered, the children who grew up traumatized, the community that was punished collectively, and the generations that followed carrying memories of an event they could not fully voice. It extends into the historical record itself, which documented the crime and the punishment, but struggled to document the context, the daily accumulated horrors that led 1 woman to conclude that poisoning 9 men was a morally defensible act. And it extends into our present moment, as we continue to grapple with the legacy of American slavery and the ways that violence, once introduced into the foundations of a society, echoes forward through time in ways we are still learning to recognize and address. These are the stories we tell on Shadows of the South, not because they are comfortable or uplifting, but because they are true, and because the South's attempt to forget them, to bury them alongside the bodies in unmarked graves, to erase them from the historical narrative in favor of myths about genteel plantation life and faithful servants, represents its own form of moral failure. If we cannot face what happened, if we cannot sit with the discomfort of understanding how people behaved when they were given absolute power or subjected to absolute powerlessness, then we learn nothing. We simply perpetuate the silences that allowed such evil to flourish in the first place. Clara's story, like so many stories from this dark period, demands that we look directly at what human beings are capable of doing to each other when the systems and structures that should protect human dignity are instead designed to destroy it. That is the true horror and the true lesson of the antebellum South, and that is why we continue to dig these stories from the archives and bring them into the light, however painful that light might be.